There's a particular kind of amnesia that comes with inherited wealth. The ability to forget where the money actually came from, to erase the blood and dirt and brutality that funded the mansions and the social positions and the gilded lives. The Astor family, by the time they were hosting balls for 400 guests and building hotels out of spite, had perfected this amnesia. They were old money, respectable, refined, the kind of family that set the standards for American aristocracy. Before we expose how America's most refined family built their fortune on violence, exploitation, and ruthless business practices that would make modern robber barons look ethical, hit that subscribe button immediately, because what you're about to discover will permanently change how you see old money families. Turn on notifications because we're ripping away the elegant facade to reveal the brutal origins of dynasties that pretend they've always been respectable. Drop a comment with which refined family you want us to investigate next. And share this video because the truth about how these fortunes were really built needs to be told. Subscribe now. The dirt we're about to dig up is darker than anything you've imagined. But before the mansions, before the social dominance, before Carolyn Astor decided who was acceptable in New York society, there was John Jacob Astor. And John Jacob Astor was not refined. He was brutal, calculating, willing to do absolutely anything for profit. And the fortune he built, the foundation of everything the Astor family would become, was constructed through a fur trade so violent, so exploitative, so environmentally destructive that it nearly wiped out entire species and definitely wiped out entire indigenous communities. This is the story of how one man built what would become, adjusted for inflation, a $110 billion fortune, how he did it through methods that combined legitimate business with fraud, extortion, bribery, and systematic destruction of both people and ecosystems, and how, within 2 generations, his descendants had laundered that dirty money into respectability, so complete that no one questioned where it came from. John Jacob Astor was born on July 17, 1763 in Waldorf, Germany, a small village near Heidelberg. His father, Jacob Astor, was a butcher. The family was not poor, but they were working class. There were multiple children and limited prospects. Germany in the 1760s was a patchwork of principalities. Opportunities for advancement were limited. The social order was rigid. If you were born a butcher's son, you died a butcher, or maybe a tradesman if you were ambitious. John Jacob was ambitious, but he understood that Germany would never give him the opportunities he wanted. He needed to leave. His older brother George had already emigrated to London, where he ran a small shop selling musical instruments. In 1779, at age 16, John Jacob joined him. He spent 4 years in London learning English, learning business, and most importantly, learning about a trade that was making fortunes for those willing to take risks. The North American fur trade, beaver pelts from North America, were in enormous demand in Europe. Beaver fur was used to make felt for hats, and hats were essential fashion items for wealthy European men. The problem was supply. Beavers in Europe had been nearly hunted to extinction. The ones that remained were carefully controlled by aristocratic hunting preserves, but North America had beavers in apparently unlimited numbers, and the indigenous peoples who lived there had centuries of expertise in hunting and preparing pelts. The fur trade had been operating for over a century by the time John Jacob learned about it. French trappers, British Hudson's Bay Company, various independent traders, all were extracting fortunes from American beavers. But the trade was inefficient. Too many middlemen. Too much profit being lost to traders and shippers and merchants at various stages. John Jacob, with the systematic thinking that would characterize his entire career, saw how to cut out the middlemen if you could establish direct relationships with indigenous hunters. Buy pelts at the source, ship them yourself to Europe, and sell them directly to hat makers, you could multiply profits exponentially. All you needed was capital to start, ruthlessness to compete, and a complete disregard for anything except profit. John Jacob had the ruthlessness. The disregard came naturally. The capital he would have to acquire in 1783, at age 20, John Jacob Astor sailed for America. He arrived in Baltimore in March 1784, with 7 flutes to sell. Gifts from his brother George, who thought John Jacob might enter the musical instrument trade. John Jacob sold the flutes, used the money to buy furs from local traders, sold those furs at a small profit, and reinvested everything in more furs. Within 6 months, he had established himself as a fur buyer in New York City. He spoke German, which was useful because many fur traders coming down from Canada were German immigrants. He spoke English with a heavy accent that he never lost, but he spoke it well enough to negotiate, and he was learning the indigenous languages spoken by the tribes that supplied pelts. By 1786, John Jacob had saved enough money to make his first trip into the interior, traveling up the Hudson River and into what is now upstate New York. Meeting directly with Iroquois hunters, what he saw on that trip convinced him that the real money wasn't in buying from middlemen in New York. It was in controlling the supply chain from the source. He would need to establish trading posts in indigenous territory, need to develop relationships with tribal leaders, need to create a system that allowed him to dominate the trade, but he would also need something else. He would need to be willing to do things his competitors wouldn't. And that's exactly what John Jacob Astor did. The fur trade that John Jacob Astor entered in the 1780s was already brutal. It had been operating for over a century, and it had established patterns of exploitation that were remarkably consistent. European traders would arrive at indigenous villages with goods, blankets, metal tools, alcohol, weapons. They would trade these goods for furs at exchange rates that dramatically favored the Europeans. An indigenous hunter might trade a prime beaver pelt, worth $5 in New York, roughly $150 today, for a blanket worth 50 cents, or a pint of whiskey worth 10 cents. The exchange rates were unconscionable, but they worked because the traders controlled access to European goods that indigenous peoples had become dependent on. Metal knives were objectively better than stone tools. Guns were more effective than bows. Blankets were warmer than traditional garments. Once communities became dependent on these goods, they had to continue trading to maintain access, and the traders could set whatever terms they wanted. John Jacob Astor didn't invent this system, but he perfected it. He understood that the key to maximizing profits was maximizing dependency. He began establishing trading posts throughout the Great Lakes region and into the Pacific Northwest. Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia River, established in 1811, was the westernmost American settlement at the time. At each trading post, Astor's employees, called factors, followed a carefully designed system. First, they would establish relationships with tribal leaders, offering gifts, extending credit, creating obligations. Then they would introduce alcohol. Not occasionally, but systematically, whiskey became the primary medium of trade. Astor's factors would arrive at villages with barrels of whiskey. They would offer it freely at first, creating dependency, creating demand. Then they would only trade whiskey for furs, and they would only accept the finest pelts. The alcohol dependency this created was devastating. Tribal communities that had functioned for centuries began to collapse. Men would trade entire seasons' worth of furs for a few days of drinking. Families would go without food, while hunters pursued pelts to exchange for whiskey. One missionary who visited Astor trading posts in 1809 wrote, "I have witnessed scenes of debauchery and degradation that defy description. Whole villages incapacitated by drink, children starving while their fathers trade everything for another bottle." Mr. Astor's factors encourage this. Indeed, they orchestrate it. For a drunk Indian trades more favorable terms than a sober one. This was not an accident. It was not an unfortunate side effect of trade. It was deliberate policy. Astor's written instructions to his factors, preserved in the New York Historical Society archives, are explicit. Spirits are the most profitable article we can trade. They cost us 50 cents per gallon in New York and fetch 10 times that value in furs. Be liberal with spirits to establish demand, then restrict supply to drive up prices. Another memo, dated 1808, is even more cold-blooded. I am informed that some factors hesitate to trade spirits to Indians on moral grounds. You will remind these men that we are in business to make profit, not to serve as missionaries. If they cannot separate their religious sentiments from their commercial duties, they should seek employment elsewhere. But alcohol was just one tool in Astor's systematic exploitation. Another was debt. Factors would extend credit to indigenous hunters, offering goods in winter that would be paid back with furs in spring. The interest rates on this credit were never disclosed, and the factors controlled the accounting. An indigenous hunter might believe he had repaid his debt with the spring's furs, only to be told he still owed money that the interest had accumulated, that he needed to hunt more if he questioned the accounting. If he refused to continue hunting, the factor would threaten to cut off all trade, not just with that individual but with his entire village. Since communities were by now dependent on European goods for survival, this was an effective threat. The documented cases of this debt manipulation are extensive. One Ojibwe leader named Meshquanund, whose correspondence was translated and preserved by French missionaries, wrote in 1812, "We hunt and hunt. We bring furs until our arms ache carrying them. But the white trader says we still owe, that we must bring more. We cannot feed our families because all our time is hunting for furs to pay debts we cannot understand." Astor's trading empire expanded rapidly through the 1790s and 1800s. By 1800, he controlled approximately one-third of the fur trade in the United States. His ships sailed from New York to the Pacific Northwest, picking up furs at Fort Astoria, then continuing to China, where furs were traded for silk. tea, and porcelain, which were then sold in New York. This triangular trade was enormously profitable. A dollar invested in trade goods might return $10 in furs, which might return $50 in Chinese goods, which might sell for $200 in New York. Astor was multiplying his capital faster than almost anyone in American history, but the cost was staggering. The ecological impact was immediate, and devastating beaver populations in region after region were hunted to near extinction. Beavers are keystone species. Their dams create wetlands that support enormous biodiversity. When beaver populations collapse, entire ecosystems collapse. With them, the Great Lakes region, the Pacific Northwest, these areas underwent rapid environmental degradation as Astor's hunters pursued every last beaver. Contemporary accounts describe rivers that had once been chains of beaver ponds becoming mere streams, forests drying out as the water table dropped, species that depended on wetland habitats disappearing. One account from 1815 describes a region in what is now Michigan, where 5 years ago there were beaver dams every quarter mile, creating extensive wetlands teeming with waterfowl, fish, and game. There is now only a dry stream. The beavers are gone, trapped out entirely, and with them went everything that depended on the habitat they created. Astor didn't care when one region was trapped out. He simply moved his operations to new territory. He lobbied Congress extensively for policies that would give him access to more land, more indigenous territory, more beavers to harvest. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 was a bonanza for Astor. Suddenly, there was an enormous new territory to exploit, and Astor was among the first Americans to establish trading posts in the newly acquired land. When the War of 1812 disrupted his operations, Astor was pragmatic. He sold supplies to both the American and British forces. He didn't care who won as long as trade routes reopened. His only loyalty was to profit, and profit was extraordinary. By 1820, John Jacob Astor was the wealthiest person in the United States. His net worth was estimated at $20 million, roughly $600 million in today's currency. But his actual wealth was probably much higher. He owned the American Fur Company, which controlled approximately 75% of the fur trade in the United States. He owned ships, warehouses, trading posts throughout the continent, and he was beginning to invest in something that would ultimately make him even wealthier than furs ever did: Manhattan real estate. By 1825, John Jacob Astor understood something that most of his contemporaries didn't. The fur trade was dying, not because he had developed a conscience, he hadn't. Not because he cared about the environmental devastation or the destroyed indigenous communities, he didn't, but because the beavers were running out. Region after region had been trapped too near extinction. The remaining beaver populations were in areas that were increasingly difficult and expensive to access. Meanwhile, fashion was changing. Beaver felt hats were going out of style, replaced by silk hats. Demand was declining just as supply was becoming problematic. Astor, who was ruthlessly unsentimental about business, saw that it was time to get out. Between 1825 and 1834, he systematically liquidated his fur trading empire, selling trading posts, ships, inventory. He got out before the crash, before the market fully collapsed. Many of his competitors who couldn't believe the fur trade would ever end held on too long and were ruined when the market finally collapsed in the late 1830s. But Astor had already moved on to something far more profitable: Manhattan real estate. Astor had been buying Manhattan property since the 1790s, but it had been a side investment, something to do with excess capital. Now it became his primary focus, and the strategy he employed was as ruthlessly effective as anything he'd done in the fur trade. Manhattan in 1825 was a city of approximately 200,000 people, concentrated at the southern tip of the island. Everything north of what is now Houston Street was farmland and villages. Astor understood that cities grow, that Manhattan's growth was constrained by geography, being an island, and that land near the current city limits would become immensely valuable as the city expanded. So he began buying, not the expensive property in the developed parts of the city, but the cheap farmland on the outskirts. He bought 40 acres, 60 acres, entire farms, paying prices that farmers found generous but that were a fraction of what the land would be worth in 20 years. The strategy required patience and capital. The land wouldn't appreciate immediately. It might take decades for the city to expand far enough north to make the properties valuable, but Astor had both patience and capital, and he understood compound returns. He would buy a farm for $5,000, hold it for 20 years while the city crept north, then sell it for $200,000, or better yet, lease it for recurring income. Between 1825 and his death in 1848, Astor spent millions buying Manhattan property at his death. He owned approximately 1/50th of all Manhattan real estate. Think about that for a moment. One person owned approximately 2% of Manhattan. The properties included what would become Times Square, large portions of the Upper East Side, sections of Midtown. It was the most concentrated ownership of urban real estate in American history, and Astor's leasing strategy ensured that his family would profit from these properties for generations. He didn't sell land, he leased it. Typically on 99-year leases, tenants would pay rent to the Astor family for nearly a century, during which time they could build on the land but never own it. When leases expired, everything built on the land reverted to the Astors. They could renegotiate leases at current market rates, capturing all the value that tenants' improvements had created. It was brilliant and predatory. Tenants bore all the costs of development. The Astors reaped all the long-term benefits. By the 1840s, John Jacob Astor was receiving approximately $1 million per year in rental income, roughly $30 million today. And that income would only increase as the city grew. He had successfully transitioned from extractive resource exploitation, which eventually depletes, to rentier capitalism, which generates income indefinitely. The money from destroying beaver populations and indigenous communities had been laundered into Manhattan real estate, and that real estate would fund the family's social ambitions for the next century. When John Jacob Astor died on March 29, 1848, he was worth approximately $20 million in liquidated assets, roughly $600 million today, but the real estate holdings, if valued at their future worth rather than contemporary assessments, were worth far more. Some estimates suggest that if John Jacob could have somehow sold all his Manhattan property at 1900 prices, it would have been worth over $1 billion, roughly $30 billion in today's currency, and because he didn't sell, because he structured everything as leases, his descendants continued to collect rent on these properties for decades after his death. The fortune continued to compound. By 1890, when Caroline Astor was ruling New York society, the family was worth an estimated $100 to $200 million, somewhere between $3 and $6 billion in today's currency. By 1912, when the Titanic sank and John Jacob Astor IV went down with it, his personal fortune was estimated at $87 million, roughly $2.5 billion today. The total Astor family fortune, distributed among various branches, probably exceeded $300 million by 1912. Roughly $9 billion. Today, and that fortune, all of it, traced back to John Jacob Astor's beaver pelts and his willingness to destroy anything and anyone for profit. The transformation of the Astor family from fur traders to American aristocracy is a masterclass in reputation laundering. Within 2 generations, the family went from association with alcohol trading frontier brutality to being arbiters of refined society. This didn't happen by accident. It was carefully engineered, and it required erasing or rewriting the family's actual history. John Jacob Astor's son, William Backhouse Astor, born in 1792, was the first generation to begin this transformation. William grew up wealthy. He never worked in the fur trade, never visited a trading post, never saw the alcohol dependency and debt manipulation that funded his comfortable life. His father educated him well, sent him to the best schools, introduced him to New York's emerging merchant class. When William took over management of the family fortune in 1830, he continued his father's real estate strategy, but with one crucial addition: philanthropy, not generous philanthropy. John Jacob had famously been one of the stingiest wealthy men in America, but strategic philanthropy designed to purchase respectability. William donated to churches, to hospitals, to cultural institutions, not huge amounts, but enough to get the family name on buildings and donor lists. He joined exclusive clubs. He married into a respectable family, the Armstrongs. He began to position the Astors as established rather than nouveau rich. But the real transformation happened in the next generation, with William Backhouse Astor Jr., who married Caroline Schermerhorn in 1853. Caroline understood something that the men in the family didn't. That social position wasn't just about wealth, it was about who acknowledged you. She couldn't erase the fact that the Astor fortune came from fur trading, but she could make that history irrelevant by establishing the family as leaders of society. Her strategy was to create a social system in which the Astors were at the apex, by definition. Not because of their history, but because they said so. The 400, her famous list of acceptable families, was brilliant because it made exclusion rather than inclusion the mark of power. If you were questioning the Astors' legitimacy, you simply weren't on the list, and therefore your opinion didn't matter. Within 20 years, Caroline had successfully established that the Astors were old money. Despite the fact that John Jacob had arrived in America penniless in 1784, just 9 years before Caroline married into the family, old money status that takes multiple centuries to establish in Europe was fabricated in New York in less than a human lifetime. This was possible because America had no real aristocracy, no ancient families with undisputed claims to status. Everyone's fortune was relatively recent. The Astors were old money compared to the Vanderbilts, whose fortune came from railroads starting in the 1860s. Or the Carnegies and Rockefellers, whose industrial fortunes were even more recent. So Caroline's strategy worked. By 1880, the Astors were treated as American aristocracy. Their fur trading origins were mentioned rarely, and then only as colorful history, pioneering rather than exploitative. The alcohol trading, the debt manipulation, the systematic destruction of indigenous communities and beaver populations, all of that was simply forgotten. Newspapers writing about the Astors in the 1880s and 1890s described John Jacob as a bold entrepreneur who had opened the American West through his pioneering fur trading business. The reality that he had been a ruthless exploiter who destroyed ecosystems and communities for profit was not part of the approved narrative. This sanitized version of history was taught to subsequent generations of Astors, who genuinely believed their family fortune was built through legitimate pioneering business. When John Jacob Astor built the Astoria Hotel when he died on the Titanic in 1912, when he was mourned as an American hero, no one mentioned that his entire fortune traced back to alcohol-fueled exploitation of indigenous peoples. The laundering was complete, and this pattern, this transformation from dirty money to respectable wealth within 2 or 3 generations, became the template for American plutocracy. The robber barons of the late 19th century, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, they all saw what the Astors had accomplished. They saw that if you made enough money, if you held onto it long enough, if you donated to the right causes and married into the right families, your origins became irrelevant. Rockefeller's fortune was built on ruthless monopolistic practices that destroyed competitors, on bribing politicians and legislators, on tactics that were widely condemned during his lifetime, but within 2 generations. The Rockefellers were philanthropists, respected elder statesmen. Their foundations supported medical research and education. Carnegie's fortune came from steel mills, where workers labored in dangerous conditions for poverty wages, where union organizers were beaten or killed, where profit mattered more than human life. But Carnegie spent the last decades of his life giving away his fortune, building libraries, funding universities, and he's remembered as a philanthropist. The pattern is consistent. Make your fortune through whatever means necessary. Hold it long enough and you can rewrite history. The Astors proved it could be done, and every plutocratic family since has followed the playbook to understand the true cost of the Astor fortune. We need to look beyond the environmental destruction of beaver populations, beyond even the economic exploitation of indigenous peoples. We need to examine what happened to the communities that supplied John Jacob Astor's furs. What became of them after the traders moved on? The historical record on this is fragmentary. Indigenous communities didn't keep written records in the European style, and European observers were more interested in profit than in documenting human costs. But what evidence exists paints a devastating picture. The Chinook people, who lived at the mouth of the Columbia River near Fort Astoria, numbered approximately 22,000 in 1805 when Lewis and Clark encountered them. By 1850, after 4 decades of contact with Astor's fur trading operation and the diseases, alcohol, and economic disruption it brought, fewer than 3,000 Chinook remained. A 90% population decline in 45 years. The communities around the Great Lakes, who were among Astor's primary suppliers, underwent similar devastation. Pre-contact population estimates suggest approximately 65,000 Ojibwe in the Great Lakes region in 1760. By 1850, after decades of participation in the fur trade, the population was approximately 12,000, a 65% decline. These weren't just statistics, these were entire villages that ceased to exist. Languages that were lost, cultural practices that disappeared. The alcohol dependency that Astor's factors deliberately created had generational impacts. Communities that had been self-sufficient for centuries became unable to feed themselves because all their labor went into hunting furs for trade. Traditional governance structures broke down as leaders who tried to restrict the alcohol trade were bypassed by traders dealing directly with younger men desperate for drink. The debt cycles trapped entire communities. Families that had once been wealthy by indigenous standards, with stored food and elaborate material culture, found themselves perpetually indebted to traders, unable to accumulate anything. And when the fur trade moved on, when the beavers were gone and the traders left, these communities were abandoned. They were left with alcohol dependency, with depleted game populations, with damaged ecosystems, with debt they could never repay, with shattered social structures, One particularly heartbreaking account comes from a Jesuit missionary, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, who traveled through former Astor trading territory in 1840. He wrote, "I have encountered villages where every adult is dependent on liquor, where children starve because their fathers spend all their time hunting furs that no longer exist to trade for whiskey that traders no longer supply. The devastation is complete. These communities have been destroyed as surely as if they had been burned to the ground, and the men who did this, the traders who orchestrated this destruction, they have grown wealthy beyond measure and face no consequences for what they have done." Father de Smet specifically mentioned Astor by name, writing, "Mr. Astor is spoken of in New York as a great man, a philanthropist even. He has donated to churches and hospitals, but I have seen what his philanthropy was built upon. I have witnessed the communities his business practices destroyed, and I can say with certainty that no amount of charity in New York can balance the ledger of suffering he created in the wilderness." But de Smet's observations, published in missionary journals with limited circulation, had no impact on Astor's reputation. The suffering was too far away, too abstract, too easy to ignore. New York society saw Astor's wealth, his real estate, holdings, his position. They didn't see and didn't want to see where it came from. This willful ignorance is crucial to understanding how dirty money becomes respectable. It's not that people didn't know. Missionaries like de Smet were publishing accounts. Indigenous leaders were making their case whenever anyone would listen. It's that people chose not to know, chose to accept the sanitized version of history because confronting the reality would have been uncomfortable. If the Astor fortune was built on exploitation and destruction, what did that say about everyone who admired the Astors, who sought their approval, who benefited from their philanthropy? Easier to believe the pioneer narrative, the story of bold entrepreneurship opening the American frontier. Easier to forget the alcohol, the debt, the destroyed communities, the 90% population declines, and that's exactly what happened. Within one generation of John Jacob's death, the reality of how he made his fortune was successfully obscured. By Caroline Astor's era, it had been almost completely erased. The human cost of the Astor fortune, measured in destroyed communities and lost lives, is incalculable. Conservative estimates suggest that communities supplying Astor's fur trade experienced population declines of 50 to 90% between 1790 and 1850. If we assume that Astor's operation, which controlled approximately 75% of American fur trade at its peak, was responsible for proportional impact, we're talking about tens of thousands of deaths. Deaths from disease exacerbated by alcohol and malnutrition. Deaths from starvation as traditional economies collapsed. Deaths from violence as communities fractured under the stress of exploitation. John Jacob Astor built a fortune worth, in today's terms, somewhere between $600 million and $30 billion depending on how you calculate his real estate holdings. And he built it on a foundation of tens of thousands of deaths. That's the reality that gets erased when we talk about old money. When we admire the elegance of Caroline Astor's balls or the architecture of the Waldorf Astoria, every dollar of that fortune has blood on it. Every property the Astors owned was purchased with money extracted from dying communities. Every social triumph Caroline achieved was funded by the systematic destruction of indigenous peoples. And somehow, we're supposed to forget that. Somehow, 3 generations is enough time to launder genocide into respectability. The Astor fortune isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a template. The business model that John Jacob Astor pioneered became the foundation for how American capitalism operates. Extract resources from vulnerable populations, maximize profit by externalizing costs, accumulate capital faster than anyone else, transition to renty income before the extraction becomes unprofitable, use wealth to purchase political influence and social legitimacy, and wait for memories to fade, for the suffering you caused to be forgotten, for your origins to be sanitized. Then your old money, respectable. Beyond question, this is how the Vanderbilts did it. Cornelius Vanderbilt built his shipping and railroad empire through rate wars that destroyed competitors, through bribery of politicians and judges, through labor practices that killed workers. But his grandchildren were society leaders. They married European aristocrats. They built mansions that are now museums. The dirty origins were forgotten within 2 generations. This is how the Rockefellers did it. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil through tactics so ruthless that the federal government eventually broke up the company as an illegal monopoly. But the Rockefeller Foundation funds medical research. Rockefeller University is a prestigious scientific institution. The family is associated with philanthropy, the monopolistic practices, the destroyed competitors, the corrupted political system, all forgotten. This is how Carnegie did it. Andrew Carnegie made his fortune while workers in his steel mills earned poverty wages, and died in preventable industrial accidents. But Carnegie libraries are in thousands of towns across America. Carnegie Hall is one of the world's great concert venues. He's remembered as a generous philanthropist. The 12-hour workdays, the 6-day workweeks. The workers killed by molten steel or exhaustion, forgotten. The pattern is so consistent that it's clearly not accidental. It's systematic. American capitalism has always allowed, even encouraged, ruthless extraction during wealth accumulation, with the implicit understanding that if you get rich enough, you can buy legitimacy later. The Astors were the first American family to successfully execute this playbook at a massive scale. John Jacob showed that you could build extraordinary wealth through exploitation, that there were no consequences if you were successful enough. His descendants showed that you could transform that exploitative fortune into social dominance, that the origins of your wealth could be erased or rewritten within a human lifetime. Together, they established that in America, money doesn't just talk, it rewrites history. This has profound implications for how we think about wealth inequality today. The billionaires of our era, the tech founders and hedge fund managers and private equity raiders, they're following the same playbook. Make your fortune however you can. Externalize costs onto workers or users or the environment. Accumulate wealth faster than anyone else, then use that wealth to reshape your image. Jeff Bezos built Amazon through labor practices in warehouses that are documented as brutal, through tax avoidance schemes that starved local governments of revenue, through predatory pricing that destroyed competitors, but he's also funding space exploration, buying newspapers, donating to causes. Is he buying legitimacy, following the Astor playbook, hoping that in 50 years, people will remember the philanthropy and forget the warehouse workers? The Sackler family made billions from OxyContin, from a pharmaceutical that killed over 500,000 Americans in the opioid crisis, but their name was on museums, on university buildings, on art galleries. They were trying to follow the playbook, make your fortune however you can, then buy respectability through philanthropy. It didn't work this time. The crisis was too recent, the deaths too visible. Museums started removing the Sackler name. But give it another century, will people remember? Or will the Sacklers eventually be laundered into respectability like the Astors were? The difference between the Astors and the Sacklers might just be timing. The Astors destroyed indigenous communities far from centers of power, where the suffering was invisible to the people whose opinion mattered. The Sacklers' victims were too close, too visible, too recent, but the fundamental model is the same. Profit from human suffering, accumulate wealth by legitimacy. And historically it works. The Astor fortune, built on alcohol trading and debt manipulation and the destruction of communities and ecosystems, became respectable within 3 generations. The family that arose from that brutality ruled New York society. They set the standards for American aristocracy. They built landmarks that still define the city, and almost no one remembers how they actually made their money. That's the genius and the horror of the American system. Time and money can launder anything. John Jacob Astor was a butcher's son from Germany who became the richest man in America through tactics that involved deliberately creating alcohol dependency in vulnerable populations. 3 generations later, his descendants were hosting balls for 400, deciding who was acceptable in society, being treated as American royalty, the exploitation, the suffering, the destroyed communities, all forgotten, replaced by a narrative of pioneering entrepreneurship and business acumen. And this narrative persists. Even today, when historians discuss the Astor fortune, they focus on real estate strategy, on John Jacob's business intelligence, on the family's social influence, the actual methods, the human cost, the ecological devastation that's barely mentioned. It's treated as historical context. Regrettable perhaps, but not really relevant to understanding the family's success. But it's completely relevant because it reveals that the success was built on willingness to cause suffering on an industrial scale. John Jacob Astor succeeded not because he was smarter or worked harder than his competitors, but because he was willing to be more ruthless. He succeeded because he had no moral limits, no line he wouldn't cross for profit. And American capitalism rewarded that ruthlessness with wealth beyond imagination. Then American society within 3 generations transformed that ruthlessness into respectability. That's the story of the Astor fortune. That's the story of how dirty money becomes old money. That's the story of American capitalism itself. The physical manifestations of the Astor fortune still dominate Manhattan. The original family properties have mostly been sold, but the impact remains. The Waldorf Astoria, discussed in the previous story, was built with Astor money. The Astor Library, now part of the New York Public Library, was John Jacob Astor's primary philanthropic legacy. Astor Place, Astoria in Queens, numerous buildings and streets carry the family name. These landmarks are treated as monuments to success, to the American dream, to what can be achieved through ambition and business acumen, but they're actually monuments to forgetting every time we walk past a building with the Astor name, every time we stay at the Waldorf Astoria, every time we treat the Astor fortune as an example of legitimate wealth creation. We're participating in the erasure of history. We're choosing to forget the beaver populations hunted to extinction, the indigenous communities destroyed, the alcohol dependency deliberately created, the debt cycles that trapped families for generations. We're choosing to accept the sanitized version, the story of pioneering entrepreneurs rather than ruthless exploiters. And this choice has consequences, because if we accept that the Astor fortune was legitimately earned, we accept the methods used to earn it. We accept that exploitation is okay if it's successful, that human suffering is acceptable if it produces wealth, that there's a statute of limitations on accountability. The Astor fortune is not unique, it's representative. Almost every major American fortune from the 18th and 19th centuries was built through similar methods: extraction, exploitation, externalization of costs, accumulation of capital, then transformation into legitimacy. The difference is that the Astors did it first. At the largest scale, most successfully, they established the template that others followed, and they proved that it works, that no matter how dirty the origins of your fortune, time and money can make it respectable. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in 1784 with 7 flutes and a butcher's work ethic. He died in 1848, worth $20 million, built on a foundation of ecological devastation and human suffering by 1890. His granddaughter-in-law, Caroline, was the queen of American society, the family's brutal origins completely obscured by 1912, when John Jacob Astor IV died on the Titanic. He was mourned as an American hero, a member of a distinguished old family. The transformation was complete. The butcher's grandson had become aristocracy. The fur trader's descendants had become society leaders. The fortune built on alcohol and exploitation had become respectable wealth. And no one, or almost no one, remembered the truth. This is how systems of wealth perpetuate themselves, not through merit, not through continued value creation, but through successful forgetting. If we remembered how these fortunes were actually built, if we maintained awareness of the human and environmental costs, they couldn't maintain their legitimacy. But we don't remember. We choose not to remember, because remembering is uncomfortable. It's easier to admire the elegance of the Waldorf than to think about the indigenous communities destroyed to fund it. It's easier to respect old money than to examine where it came from. It's easier to accept the myth of pioneering entrepreneurship than to confront the reality of systematic exploitation. So we forget, and in forgetting, we allow the pattern to continue. Today's billionaires are building their fortunes through methods that, in many cases, are just as exploitative as John Jacob Astor's. Tech companies that extract value from users, without compensation, that destroy traditional industries without concern for displaced workers, that avoid taxes while using public infrastructure, financial firms that crash the economy through reckless speculation, get bailed out by taxpayers, then continue the same practices. Pharmaceutical companies that profit from addiction, that price life-saving drugs beyond reach, that prioritize shareholder returns over patient health. These are the modern equivalents of the fur trade. Different industries, same fundamental model. Extract maximum profit, externalize costs, accumulate capital, and in 50 years, 100 years, will these fortunes be respectable too? Will we have museums and concert halls with tech billionaire names on them, while we forget the gig workers, paid poverty wages, the communities destroyed by automation, the mental health crisis driven by addictive platforms? Will we have libraries funded by hedge fund managers, while we forget the pension funds they raided, the companies they loaded with debt and bankrupted, the workers who lost jobs so private equity could extract maximum value? The Astor fortune teaches us that the answer is probably yes, because time and money can launder anything, because we prefer comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths, because choosing to remember is harder than choosing to forget. John Jacob Astor built a fortune that adjusted for inflation and accounting for the full value of the real estate empire it funded was worth somewhere between $600 million and $110 billion. He built it through systematic exploitation of indigenous peoples, through deliberate creation of alcohol dependency, through debt manipulation, through ecological devastation, through methods that cause suffering measured in tens of thousands of lives. And within 3 generations, that fortune was respectable. Within 3 generations, his descendants were setting the standards for American society. Within 3 generations, the dirty money had become old money. That's not a failure of the Astor family, that's a feature of the American system. were designed to forget, to allow wealth to launder itself through time and philanthropy, to treat the successful as admirable regardless of how they achieved success. And until we change that, until we insist on remembering, on maintaining awareness of where these fortunes actually come from, the pattern will continue. The next John Jacob Astor is out there right now, building a fortune through exploitation. And in 3 generations, their descendants will be respectable and will have forgotten again. If this deep dive into America's dirtiest fortune opened your eyes to how old money really works, subscribe immediately, because we're exposing the brutal origins of every refined family that pretends they've always been respectable. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into which Gilded dynasty built their empire on suffering. Drop a comment telling us which supposedly respectable old money family you want us to investigate next. The Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies,